Hey, what up squad, it's your boy K-Flow, and in this video I'm going to show you how to replace your rack. Let's get this thing started. So for those of you who are new to my channel, the purpose of my channel is to show you how you can engineer your very perfect Tacoma. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and replace the steering rack. And I'm going to be using my 2009 Toyota Tacoma TRD Sport 4x4. So make sure you smash that like and subscribe button so you're up to date with my latest video releases. So this video was also shot in tandem with an AC compressor replacement. And you'll see that the sway bar was removed in some shots, but you don't necessarily need to do that because there should be enough room for you to pull out that steering rack with the sway bar in place. To give you guys a quick overview of how to do the removal and replacement of the steering rack, the first thing you have to do is remove the tie rod assemblies, remove the two hoses going into the steering rack, and then remove the intermediate shaft. Now the removal and the reinstallation of the tie rod assemblies will be in full detail in another video on my channel, so I will not be going over that in this specific video. So just another heads up guys, initially I was trying to do this removal with the tie rod assembly still on, so you will see them still on in the video, and I had to remove them later on. Initially I thought I can just move the steering rack onto the passenger side and then squeeze it out the front, but unfortunately it became too cumbersome and I did have to pull those off. So learn from my error guys and pull out those tie rod assemblies first. Now let's get to the garage. So those were the bolts that hold that steering rack in place. So what we're going to do is brush off all the debris and then apply some PB Blaster on those threads. So here we'll also apply PB Blaster to the threads on the steering shaft, as well as the threads on the hoses going into the steering rack. And we'll make sure we let that stuff soak for a little while too. So let's place an oil pan underneath and use a 17mm wrench to remove that driver's side hose. So those hoses are really tight guys, and they're actually in a very small spot. So that I have better leverage, I'm going to remove this bracket here, and that's a 17mm socket. So now I have a lot more room to actually work there, and loosening those hoses is a little bit easier. I have that passenger side hose removed now, and now it's draining. Now the driver's side hose has a hose clamp on there. So what I'm going to do is remove that hose clamp and then remove that fitting from the steering rack. Now we can remove the bracket that holds these hoses up against the steering rack and this hose up against the frame. It's a 12mm socket. Now we're going to remove that bolt to disconnect the shaft from the rack. Now I'm going to jam a chisel in between the ears of that yoke to spread that so that the steering shaft can come off the steering rack. So from underneath, I took my pry bar, put it in between the U-joint, and then just use the housing of the differential as a lever point, and it's slowly starting to come up. So I have it partially upwards now, but now I'm using the pry bar, so you can see that's the tip of the pry bar there, and I'm mounting the tip of the pry bar onto the U-joint so that I can take a hammer and hammer it from the other side. So there's the end of the pry bar right there, so I can hammer against it. So after all that hammer guys, it looks like steering shaft is completely off the steering rack. A lot of rust on that bad boy. So now I'm going to try to remove the nuts and the bolts holding that steering rack there, and they're both 17 millimeters. I shifted the steering rack all the way to right, and that's giving me enough clearance to remove that bolt. This is the part of the video where I do remove the tie rod assemblies. And now we're going to transition into removal of the steering rack. So there's the steering rack, guys, in all its glory. It's in rough shape. The road salts here in the Northeast are pretty rough on car parts. That's pretty rusted out. The outer shell is rusted out too. So now we'll have to take off this splash guard. We'll use a pry tool to remove the plastic clips that holds that thing in place. Now that we have direct access to that pump, we'll use a 17mm wrench to undo that banjo bolt up top there. So now we're back on the engine bay. We'll have to remove that hose clamp so that both hoses coming from the steering rack can be replaced completely. Now we'll also have to remove this 12mm bolt here, because this bolt is a bracket that holds this hose, and this hose is connected to the reservoir we just removed. So here's what the two look like, guys. And in order to put this new one on, I'll actually have to remove these inner tie rods. And since these look really fresh, I am also going to lay down a coat of Por 15 on the surface so that it's ready for winter and all the salt spray that we'll get. Removing the inner tie rod will probably be kind of difficult since it's not mounted on the vehicle right now, and I'll probably use a pry bar here to go through and mount that on the bench vise so that this whole thing doesn't rotate as I'm trying to remove this inner tie rod out. So first I'm going to remove this boot, and that will be done by removing this hose clamp here and also this pinch clamp here. So now that we have access to this inner portion of the inner tie rod, we'll have to remove this locking washer here. I'll use a hammer to unfold this, and then also use a pipe clamp to undo this completely. So what I've done right now, guys, is float this steering rack on 2 blocks. So my plan here is to clean up all these outer surfaces with acetone to degrease it, and then add some Por 15 on that surface after it's completely degreased. And by floating it, I can actually paint all of the outside in one go without having to stop, let it dry, and then turn it over. So that's the plan. I'm also going to be using this wax and tar remover, guys, to further clean the surface for the Por 15 to stick. So I'm going to be using this POR15 paint to stop corrosion from happening. This will be a nice coating for the outside of that steering rack. So here's a little hack, guys. What I did here was I actually used 2 self-tapping screws on the bottom so that I can open up both of them and pour it out that way. Because if you open up the top of the can, the paint ends up curing on the inside of the top of the can once you close it, and it's a real pain in the ass to remove that top. By doing this, you'll prevent the inside from curing. And on top of that, this can I do store in the fridge so that it lasts longer. This stuff is a little bit on the expensive side. So I'm going to do the same thing with these tie rods, guys. I already brushed off all the rust. Now I'm cleaning the surfaces with acetone, and then I'll also apply the POR15. You'd obviously want to be careful when you apply paint on this area, because you don't want to get any of that POR15 on the tip of this Zerk fitting, because that will clog it up. So while the paint is drying, I'm preparing the hoses now, guys. These are the new hoses here, and those are the old one there. And comparing the two, it looks like I'm going to need to pull this off from the old assembly. The new hose does not have any of these 2 brackets here that hold it. So these look like they're just clamped around here. I might be able to pull this out by driving a screwdriver, a really small flathead screwdriver in there to see if I can pry that open. Yeah, that was it, guys. That was pretty straightforward. This one I took to the bench vise to see if I can separate it here. So with these, I'll use a wire brush to descale them. And these we could just clean up with some Armor All. Now that we have these wire brushed, I'm going to be spraying this down with OSPO, which is a rust converter. We have to let these sit for several hours before we can actually paint it with the POR15.
2,000 years later.
Now that all the rust has been converted, I'm going to wire brush it one more time and then clean up everything with acetone. Now we can paint all these pieces with POR15. The POR15 has finally cured on the steering rack, and now I'm going to be able to mount it onto the truck itself. I did take a wire brush to these bolts so that there's no corrosion or crud in the threads there. And we snug them down with a 17mm wrench and socket. Now I should be able to mount the inner tie rod onto that steering rack. I have the full details, including torque specs and everything you'll need, in a separate video. Now we could torque down that steering rack, 17mm to 68 foot-pounds. So this one, new hoses, guys. This hose goes from the power steering pump and into the steering rack. This does come with a new seal as well as new washers. We'll have to make sure we lube up that seal prior to installing it at the tip of that fitting. So we'll do that now. We'll lube it up with ATF. So this does come with new washers. So when we install it onto the pump, we gotta make sure that we have a washer on the one end of this banjo bolt. Then this fitting goes through like this, and then the other washer goes in there. And this whole thing goes onto the steering pump. So these are the two hoses for the low pressure side, guys. I made sure to keep the old one so that I know the orientation of how the new one's gonna go. So here's the other fitting. So we'll install that first. And again, we'll have to make sure we apply some ATF on that O-ring too before installing it. I'm going to put a little bit of ATF at the tip here so that the hose slides over real nicely. Now we can tighten down that hose clamp. So before we reinstall the steering rack to the intermediate shaft, there's two things we gotta double check. The first one is we gotta make sure that the wheels in the front are tracking straight, or as straight as possible. We also gotta make sure that the clock spring in the steering wheel is also tracking straight. And we double check that by removing the airbags. That can be done really easily. To remove the airbags, there's only a few steps you need to do. We have to remove the plates that cover each side of the steering wheel here, which exposes two screws, one on each side. One screw right there, and the other screw is in the same area on the opposite end. And those are both T25 Torx bits. Once we pull this airbag out, there's three connections in the back that we have to undo. Those connections are these two harnesses here and the spade connector here. And these all just unclip. For the two harnesses, we have to use a flathead screwdriver to pry up this little yellow piece, and this harness just comes off. For the spade connection, we just pull it right off. So we push these two harnesses to the side. Then we double check the clock spring to make sure it's centered. So we take a flashlight, we shine it right there, and you'll see there's that bright yellow marker right there to show that the steering wheel is tracking straight. If it's not tracking straight, like let's say it's out of position by a whole turn, and we shine a flashlight through it, you'll see that the yellow marker is no longer visible. So if we put it back, it's proper orientation, that yellow marker will show up. Now we could reinstall the intermediate shaft onto that steering rack. So the first thing we'll do is add some anti-seize so it's not seized up when we have to remove it in the future. Then we could install the steering shaft and tighten down the bolt to 26 foot-pounds. We should be able to turn the steering wheel to help tighten that bolt down. So now we gotta bleed the system, guys. And here's the current setup. What I've done so far is I've capped off the low pressure side. This is the return side to the reservoir I've capped that off with a glove and a zip tie. And pretty much I disconnected it, and I have this return hose coming straight down. And that one is being caught by an oil pan. The reservoir is currently filled right now, and we'll turn the wheel with the engine off, left and right, until we see a continuous flow out of this hose here. Always make sure to refill the reservoir after each turn. If it's still unclear, guys, the low pressure side is shown here in this diagram. And when I am bleeding the system, that new hose actually came in 3 different pieces. So I was just able to break off the middle section of it and use that to route the ATF so that it drains right out onto an oil pan. Now that we've run the ATF through the system, we can reconnect those 2 hoses and tighten down that hose clamp. Gotta be careful not to make a mess here, guys. Now we could also put back the clamps that hold the hose against the frame. Now we could install the skid plate bracket and tighten down those 17mm bolts to 35 foot-pounds. So that's pretty much it for this video. The rest of the job is just reassembly of that front skid plate and putting the front wheels back on. Now you will have to do an alignment on your truck after it's all said and done. And that video is actually detailed in this channel, so make sure you check that out. I do show you how to do a wheel alignment at home. Lastly, when purchasing new hoses, that low pressure fitting that I put right onto the steering rack is actually sold separately. So make sure you're aware of that when you are doing this job, so it saves you time and effort. If you like the content creation of this channel, make sure you smash that like and subscribe button, guys. And you can further support my channel by becoming a Patreon patron. So go to patreon.kflow-crib.com, or you can also buy a t-shirt from my Teespring store. Check that out at kflow-crib.com. And until next time, guys, peace out.